no longer vow our mutual destruction, but solemnly acknowledge our interdependence as free and equal citizens of our common motherland. And this was on Reconciliation Day in 1995. Thanks, Martin. Francesco, over to you.
So here we are.
Yeah, great, Fanie. Wonderful presentation. Also, you all see who have read the book, there is also evolution in the theory of Fanie, and he is constantly thinking about those issues and developing new ideas, and I'm very, very glad that he shared this and that we can discuss this also in this group with you. How about, would you like to have a 5 minutes break and then have a discussion? Maybe it's a good moment to take a bit of air or whatever. And then in 5 minutes, we come back and then please prepare questions. Francesco, how do you want to have it? Does people write questions in the chat, or that everybody has his word and raises his hand? Or prepare?
Maybe we can ask first our guest. How long are you staying with us, Fanie?
I'm happy to stay for another hour.
Okay, then maybe we can also do one-to-one. What do you
So
think?
we will do it one-to-one. Okay. And so please give a sign, raise your hand, or physically or by this reaction sign, and then we will do it one by one. Great. Thank you very much.
Great. See you in 5 minutes.
Yeah. Start. I think we should use the time.
Yes.
Yeah. We have Iba's question.
Yes.
Should we go one by one or raising hands?
One by one.
One by one.
Yes, Iba, if you want, you can. So we see your question.
Yeah, definitely. So my question is especially directed in the case of the agonist process, which I am part of, and also people in the Thawra in Lebanon here are. And I would really like to know what people who are left outside of the privileged circles of leadership can do in the power transfer process. How effective can that be? And if you have any answers or suggestions of what can we do in this case.
Okay, Francesco, I just want to ask your guidance. Do you want me to respond one-on-one, or how would you like me to?
Yes, I think it's a good idea to have this one-on-one approach.
Okay. Hiba, yeah, that's a really important question. You know, it's also the question that I think that sets apart peace processes these days from peace processes before, is that there is an expectation that people will participate. And that was not the case before at all. And so we need to acknowledge that and know that we are only at the beginning of understanding how people best participate in these processes. I think one of the things that is very important is for peace negotiations to be held accountable to a public. Peace processes very often can develop their own dynamic that begins to become like we're in this together between the negotiators, but only for ourselves. And let's see how we can make the best for ourselves around the table. And people around the table often recognize that if they do a few deals, you know, everybody around the table can benefit very nicely, and the country is none the better off. So to keep the process accountable towards the general population is really, really important. And I think this is part of where civic groups need to mobilize to demand input to peace processes, and to demand concrete milestones in the transfer of power that will. So let me give you a couple of these concrete transfers of power that happened in South Africa. For example, in South Africa, we had basically the input from general people was via protest. And it was a very robust and very sometimes damaging process. But eventually what happened was that civil society responded by creating a national peace infrastructure of peace committees that operated in, I think, something like 20,000 or 10,000, I can't remember the exact amount, but it is in the thousands of communities. And they together formed an infrastructure of peace that had a national council of a national peace accord. And it's at this national peace accord where Mandela and de Klerk for the first time and Buthelezi came together and signed a declaration rejecting political violence. So it was as if the civic people, the ordinary people, were able to create a platform for politicians to do that one step that none of them have been able to do before. And that created a breakthrough in the negotiations, because on both sides there were dirty tricks. The ANC had a big arms cachet, and so on. So it happened in terms of the security sector quite efficiently. In South Africa, where it did not happen so efficiently was in the distribution of financial wealth. And we were at that point quite keen to provide a investment-friendly environment and not to chase investment away. So the civics kind of gave the politicians a bit of a break on that. But I think that was a mistake. So in the first instance, ordinary people can mobilize in terms of an infrastructure of peace that can have a seat at the table at national negotiations. The second thing is women's groups, I think, are crucial to work towards a women's voice at the table, especially also in the Middle East, but other places too, equally importantly. And we've seen that happening in Iraq, for example, quite at quite an impressive level. And the third is that, and this is about impunity. And so here is the thing: when political leaders make an agreement, impunity is most often written into this agreement. So that means we're going to pardon you, you pardon us, and we all get off free. And our peace agreement, which was in effect our interim constitution, had a clause for amnesty, that everybody would get amnesty. If we had stopped at that point, there would have been no truth commission in South Africa. But then the civics, the ordinary people, pushed back, and they did so through the elected parliament in South Africa. So that is another avenue. The one is civics forming an infrastructure. In this case, they pushed through parliament for a different kind of amnesty, which would be a conditional amnesty, where perpetrators would come forward and in exchange for truth, with other words, telling what they did and why and where precisely, verified by an investigation unit, they would then get amnesty. But it wasn't drawing a blank slate over the past. So I think that's another way that ordinary people can hold these guys at the top table accountable. And then I'd say a third thing. I'd say that apart from the NGOs and the peace structures, apart from parliament, in South Africa, one of the things that made a breakthrough was the coming together of business leaders, trade unionists, and religious leaders. And because religious leaders, we say jokingly, they had the people, and the trade unions had the ear of the ANC, and the business leaders had the money. And so they came together, and they became a very powerful lobby also towards accountability for the politicians. And they formed a power base outside the peace negotiations, which the peace talks had to take account of, because you can't lose your religious leaders, you cannot lose your trade unionists, and you cannot lose your business leaders. So those kinds of alliances, if you will, are important ways in which the circle can widen towards inclusion at the table. Unfortunately, these days, the trend is for agreements to be very wordy, very lovely, very beautiful, very inclusive on paper, but not at all so in practice. And that is why they fail. So these are three things I think that groups can do to push for more inclusivity.
Thank you very much, Fanie.
Thank you.
I've also collected some other questions. I have also myself a question. So I'm working on the relationship between trust and reconciliation. And I found interesting in your one of your last slides when you wrote that full trust is not needed. And I'm interested into knowing more from you about the relationship between trust and reconciliation, according also to your studies and to your experience. It will be very precious to me. Because I have a feeling that between trust and reconciliation, there is a kind of double implication that from one side, I see trust as something that is required to get reconciliation, but from the other side, the reconciliation has also the capability to enact trust. So
for sure. Yeah, and I think to try and that's a really interesting question. I think in trying to sequence them, I think we will get it always wrong. I think trust and reconciliation works in very dynamic ways with each other. That's not easy to sequence. I will give you a practical example, Francesco. In Rakhine now, the trust levels are extremely low at all different levels in society, because every time there is a social unrest, the military, called the Tamado, the army, comes down like hell and brimstone on those communities. They have what they call the 4 cuts policy, which is cutting recruits, cutting resources, cutting various lifelines, and then in terms of the Muslims, particularly severely, burning houses down, driving people out, and so on. So the trust, that kind of engagement is very low, but then between groups in that area as well, there's virtually no trust. Between the Buddhist group, they're called ethnic Rakhine, and they actually see themselves as an independent group, even vis-a-vis the Buddhists in Naypyidaw and Yangon. They feel like they're their own little nation state. And then you have the Muslims, they also divided between themselves, and you have a small minorities and so on. So how do you begin to build trust in a situation like that? So what we have adopted is a working method through insider mediation, where we don't initially request face-to-face meetings. We don't naively bring people around the table, groups of Muslims and Buddhists, and say, now you've got to make peace and trust each other. Because, the contact hypothesis have shown also the flip side of that, which is if you just bring people together like this without a proper plan and a theory of change, you can do more harm than good. And you can actually diminish trust. So what we have done is we've picked community leaders that have already got some social capital and some trust within their own groups. So we leverage off that bit of trust that exists between the leader and their own groups, but a leader that also is not extreme. With other words, he or she will recognize the right of the other people to coexist there. Then we take those, say 4 or 5 from the one group, 4 or 5 from the other group, and so on, and we get a core group together, and we simply work with them. We forget about the community at large. And we try in the first instance to create levels of trust here. And what we've seen is one doesn't need complete trust initially. You just need sufficient trust for the next step and the next step and the next step. You're not asking people to trust each other completely at the beginning. You're simply saying, will you be able to do this? And will you then do it? So the first thing people were willing to do in Mongdo, which is the epicenter of whatever, was they simply said, we're going to pick up trash together. That's the only thing we can trust to do together, is to pick up trash, because that clearly benefits everyone. But then you suddenly had Muslims and Buddhists and others rolling their sleeves up together in the street, picking up garbage, going into each other's neighborhoods where they were never allowed before, walking in the streets, doing something good together. The next time we had an anti-trash campaign, suddenly the army said, but listen, we'll send some soldiers to come and help you pick up trash. You know? And now you're beginning to build a little bit of trust between also the people on the ground and the authorities. And you begin to look at that level of trust. And so it's so I suppose my message to you is a precautionary note, not to jump into immediately trying to, you know, magically produce trust, but very slowly, incrementally, work with insider mediation. Let those people who already have trust with their communities mediate that relationship and bring people together in common projects, and then draw the government in, etc. Now, all of this is very fragile and can be disturbed at any moment. But my take is also that more resilient communities are never a bad thing, and that should the macro developments become favorable, this will become an invaluable instrument for further national trust building. So that is just an example of micro level trust building.
Thank you very much. It was very clear. And now we have Mika with a question.
I'm sorry, he's not there also. Sorry, I couldn't find anybody. Sorry. Yeah, I have. I'm not familiar with the South African case, but when you say the reconciliation as interdependence, it reminds me of the independence theory by Joseph Nye and Robert Cohen. According to them, the relationship creates power, and it has become a situation leading on each other. And the power of interdependence is determined by who is more disparate in this need for each other. So you say in the book, the interdependence is conceptually independence of forgiveness, like it does not require any form of intimacy, such as like what Francesco asked you, like a trust or political forgiveness. It means that reconciliation might be psychologically possible even there is no forgiveness. But I'm curious, after the official reconciliation was announced by state or community level, isn't there any power game between the two groups? And also after the reconciliation, how do discrimination or racism or trauma or like a poverty issue at the individual level are handled in a South African community?
Geez, Mika, I would really appreciate if you could send me a reference to that study that you've quoted. I would really appreciate that. First up, if you don't mind. It sounds very interesting. Secondly, I'd say that yes, reconciliation as interdependence enables a modest starting point, a very modest starting point, where you don't have to scale the moral heights of acknowledgement and forgiveness, but you can start incrementally and slowly building some form of trust with each other. But the markers, remember, for reconciliation as interdependence is inclusivity and fairness, which means it's constantly judging everything that happens. Is it becoming more inclusive and fairer? And by fair, I don't mean the whole big justice concept. I simply mean acceptable to both sides to a minimum degree. And that is something I think one can measure quite tangibly, quite easily. And you can, and in South Africa's case, you could clearly see how the process became more inclusive and fairer at every step of the process. However, what we are learning is that, and I think it's the same lesson that the America is learning, that countries in the EU are learning, I think that many countries are learning at the moment, is that cultural mindsets that underwrite the structural discrimination and the physical violence, that those cultural mindsets are the most difficult to change. And that those cultural mindsets stay the same for decades. And it's really, so racism as a cultural mindset is exceptionally difficult to root out, just like that. And we see that now. I've just, in fact, published an article in the newspaper today in South Africa on this very fact, that how is it that 30 years on, we are still struggling with this idea of racism. But, you know, I think it's absolutely, you know, I mean, Johan Galtung, I don't know if you know the name Johan Galtung, Swedish peace scholar, wrote about the 3 levels of violence. So at the top is physical violence, below that is structural violence, and below that is cultural violence, what he calls cultural violence. And cultural violence is the justification for structural violence. And also, you know, now I would tell you that, and this is now in our group, I will say, you know, I was talking to a top official in Myanmar recently, and before he could help himself, he said, but you know, these guys in Rakhine, they are lazy. And now you can see, right, there's a cultural mindset which justifies structural violence, which justifies direct violence. And it works all the way. And so in order to be a sustainable change, you have to first stop the physical violence. That's number one. Then you have to reorganize society in terms of the structures, so that it's no longer violent to one group. And then you have to do what I called in my presentation social change. This is the deep cultural work. But as far as racism specifically goes, the idea that white people are better than black people, for example, is extremely resistant to change and sits. And I've actually noticed also, you will probably be able to agree with me or maybe not, but in the East, there are different similar phenomena between groups that see themselves as better than other groups, ethnic groups within the East. So in the West, we have this thing, it's very much white and black. And that is difficult, it's slippery. For myself, I think personally as a peace, well, I wouldn't call myself an activist, but perhaps, you know, that's the closest word, is I have to remind myself every single day that every person is in principle equal. And that's not something I need evidence for, that's a principle of belief, which I simply accept, and I work from there. Hello, boy, how are you? Nice to see you. And the second is that, the second question, the second thing I remind myself, hello, is that is that we are better together than apart. And, you know, so for me, that helps me erode, that erodes the heritage of racism in my own blood, which I still carry like a virus, but which I have to fight every single day. Education is important in this, and we've done a lot of work on education in South Africa. But as long as Black kids don't have the same access to education than white kids, then you can teach whatever you like in the classroom. It's not going to make a difference so much. So that is one thing. You know, we have criminalized racism in South Africa. So if somebody says any derogatory word, they can go to prison for it, you know. So we're trying our best. We have a commission for human rights, and there's an equality court, and there's all sorts of mechanisms. We try and come to grips with this thing, but it's a slippery, slippery, slippery phenomenon. Sorry, I don't have an easy answer for you, but that I just want to say. Thank you. Nice to meet you, young man.
Thank you. Yes, Julia.
Thank you so much. Now we have Judita.
Hi. First of all, you touch upon things that are very close to my heart. I feel also because I was there in South Africa. I was working with a Zulu woman in the Drakensberg mountains, and I've heard from them many stories, and then went to Joburg and Durban and heard, you know, the white side of the story as well. And I'm really appreciative, you know, of your work there, and also of that kind of consciousness that can see, you know, that so there were some good things, some bad things, and you know, we need to learn from that, and the world is learning from that as well forward. I'm really interested, of course, you probably knew of the Rohingya and Myanmar, which is you know, one of the treasures of Buddhism, actually, one of the sources of Buddhism, and that mindfulness came out of that in a way. And I'd be really interested to hear from you if there is any joining of the spirituality in the negotiations or the reconciliation process that you're doing over there.
Thank you for that question, and thank you also for the encouragement, Judita. And so, you know, of course, you know, both Buddhism and Islam and Hinduism, in fact, sit on treasure trove of peace in that area. Peace insights. And there's undoubtedly any solution to this would have to dig into these reservoirs of insight. And I've really, it's been amazing to live a little bit in these Buddhist environments and in Yangon and to learn from some beautiful ways of approaching life that is inherent to Buddhism, which I never knew before. However, the clergy, role of the clergy, that most notably the monks in Buddhism, have been ambivalent and ambiguous in this peace process. On the one hand, in 2007, they led a very courageous, I think it's called the Velvet Revolution, where they opposed the military dictatorship, and you know, many monks were shot dead by the military and so on. On the other hand, there's also a very strong anti-Muslim movement within the Buddhist community called Mabata. And Mabata is like an informal movement that tries to claim Myanmar for the Burma and the Buddhist people only. And so and on the other hand, the Islam leaders, the Muslim leaders, are often seen as enemies of the state, and it's very difficult to give them a platform to speak openly. And so we have tended for now to stay clear of religious leaders, because in the area where we're working, they are too polarizing. But I have no doubt that if this thing gains momentum, and if the political leadership comes through, and that then the moment for religious influence will be significant. But in the Rakhine context, the religious leaders are not a good starting point for a fragile community peace process. They are too ingrained each in their own setting.
Right. I'd like to expand this just a bit, because the question was not exactly about the religious institutions, but rather about the religious or more the spiritual quality. And I don't know actually if the Buddhists there in that area in Myanmar practice or they just go by the rules, which are two different things. And sometimes in Buddhist communities, you have that as well, you know. So I'm not sure, but I was wondering if you have come across something like that, and the need to touch upon spiritual qualities within that negotiation.
Yeah, undoubtedly. I mean, I would probably now step away from Myanmar just in a bit of a broader context. Undoubtedly, when you start with a peace process, it'll ask you to draw on your spiritual resources as an individual, undoubtedly so. And wherever we come from, I think our spiritual traditions offer quite a lot of light and also darkness. Sometimes, in terms of the footprint of our religions in the world, it's not always positive. So one has to find the light and to employ your spiritual resources in the service of engagement with the other, and building a peace for not just your children but their children as well. And I think, I have absolutely no doubt that when we do get to that point in Myanmar where that's a commonly accepted approach, that Buddhism as well as Islam will be a force for the good. There are wonderful, wonderful impacts that one can see of the religion in the way it shapes the human psyche and so on. But right now it's almost captured. And let's be honest, the military did a lot of work in trying to capture, the religious force in the country, and they were quite successful. They also appointed monks in certain positions that were more compliant with them and that sort of thing. So it's difficult to separate the religious resources from the institution, but Buddhism speaks for itself, and it'll be a great asset to the country once we get this minimum momentum in the right direction. But our intuition was that to start with the religious institutions would be counterproductive at this point.
I understand. So just one more thing which I really wanted to share with you was that what you were speaking about collecting the trash, that is such a beautiful metaphor. That the first thing they do together is collect the trash,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thanks.
Yeah, it is beautiful. Thank you, Judita.
Great. Now we have Ayad.
Thank you very much, Francesco. Thank you very much, Fanie, for this exclusive, PowerPoint that you presented. I think it's really informative, and it's part of also what I want to work with. So I have a question for you, because I read your book, and I really trying to implement. I'm more into working from theory into practice. And I think your book is an interesting aspect to work with, where I'm working with Professor Leiner and also Wolfgang Dietrich, reading their stuff, and how we can implement interdependencies in the middle of conflict and how it can happen, because in the Middle East, as we know, we are all victims and we are all perpetrators at the same time. And the victim and the perpetrator sees himself as the victim, and the victim also is part of being a perpetrator. And this is where like interdependency becomes very, very harsh and hard to really implement in such a situation where both are in stagnation mode, and like I am the perpetrator and I am the victim and I am and I only see me, myself. Even if I want to make reconciliation, I want to do it with myself only. I even don't think that I might be a perpetrator. It's kind of like he will not move. And this kind of agnostic is a very good plan for it. But how can you implement it as being part of this distinguish? You know, like in the Middle East, we have those people that are really, they are all perpetrators, then they are all victims. And how interdependency can make a breakthrough. If you have maybe a vision or what you think that can happen, that can really break this stigmatization of conflict, and it keeps going into an end. Even the culture, what happens in the culture, as we discussed before with Francesco and Professor Leiner, the culture becomes, people become tired from the conflict and they do relate with each other in a different aspect away from the conflict. So where interdependency can happen, or how can you see agnostic can happen with this kind of, you know, stuck or freezing, or call it fake conflict? This part of a new idea we went off. I don't know, what do you think?
You know, I think, thank you, Ijad. That's an extremely observant point, and one we've wrestled with a lot in places like northern Uganda, for example, where, you know, you have child soldiers who get abducted at 12 years old, 10 years old, 8 years old, and then go on to commit many murders, you know. And what are they? Are they victim or perpetrator? And then suddenly you see the limits also of these liberal categories sometimes, that they don't always make so much sense in this. A couple of things I would say in this regard. First of all, I think one should study and create social consensus on two aspects of the conflict. The first is the idea of an interdependent future. So, you know, sometimes people say we should settle it, deal with the past before we can move to a future. Well, that sounds correct, but actually, I think it starts with dealing with settling the future first before you deal with the past, and which means that one should start talking about a future state of the Middle East, a desired Middle East, in which everybody is present and everybody is recognized and respected, and allow that future vision to provide the motivation to then deal with the past in a way that is not strictly developing categories of perpetrators and victims, but rather of perpetration and victimization, which means you look at harm wherever it's done. You look at perpetration wherever it's done. And the message is, we are fighting certain social ills. We're not fighting certain people. We're not fighting certain groups. We're fighting certain social ills. And we're acknowledging certain harms done across all groups. And when mothers, you know, shed tears, or fathers together across enemy lines over their lost youth, then something special happens. When that harm is acknowledged in the stories of people, something special happens. But if there isn't a vision of where you want to be going, then why are you dealing with the past? And you may get yourself entangled in that past, never to come out of it again. So for me, it's a very important thing, this idea of an interdependent future, that unless you flourish next to me, I will not flourish. Unless you are at peace, as long as you have enough to eat and a roof over your head, then I will probably also be at peace. And whereas, as you say, up till now, the politics in many parts of the world, not just the Middle East, is one of, very short-sighted sort of tribalism for me and my own, and through strength, we'll maintain our little pocket of privilege, which then leads to future insecurity. So I would think the whole thing is to start with a vision of the future, promote an interdependent future, and then look at how the cross-cutting harms, the victimization and perpetration that have been committed, and allow storytelling to bring this to the fore. I'm not suggesting one should settle the issue of the future 100% before you deal with the past. Again, it's not a strictly chronological sequencing, but it's got to be done in the context of the future, if you see what I mean. It's got to be dealing with the past is in the context of the future. It's for the future, and the future is interdependent. And so I really appreciate your pushing also my thinking, Ijad, towards more practicalities, towards what does interdependencies mean practically on the ground. It's got to do with things like mutual security, food chains, how we, our environmental responsibilities. It's got to do with, good neighborly relations. There's so many, how we use our waterways, our ports, and I mean, it can be developed in all these different ways. And I'm sure also in terms of the online world and and communication at that level. But that would be my two responses, Ijad, to your question. Theorize and sell and promote an interdependent future, and then deal with the harm caused, not with perpetrators and victims as such, but with harm and perpetration.
Thank you very much. Actually, it was very, very interesting and innovative ideas. And I will actually, to tell you the truth, I will promote it, to be honest with you. We will try to do our best. Yeah, with all our Middle Eastern partners, actually. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So now we have Abdel Ghani.
Thank you so much. Professor, I'm asking about the role of religion in dealing with such kind of political issues. Okay, have you tried using the religious texts, for example? I think concerning interdependence and the excellent image you gave about the lifeboat, the crisis inside the lifeboat is built on trust and forgiveness, as Dr. Francisco and Dr. Yed mentioned. Trust is built on admitting the wrongdoing. If I admit that I am a wrongdoer, I think the other may trust me, then there is a possibility for forgiveness, I think. So can we use religious texts to help in building such a trust, and to help in recognizing the needed interdependence in order to solve such kind of political issues? Can religion help in reaching political reconciliation or not?
Abdel Ghani, thank you to you, my brother, from the other side of Africa. I would say, first of all, religion resists to being used for anything, also for peace. Religion is not easily used for anything. And if one starts using religious networks for an external purpose to religion itself, you run a risk that it becomes seen as phony religion, and religion that is not true to its origins. So the question is more to say, what does religion offer that is peaceful inherently in the heart of religion, and build that up as an authentic contribution out of the heart of religion towards society. So in South Africa, one of the things we discovered was that we were fortunate because we had some really, really heavyweight and smart and wise political leaders during our transition, people that had credibility. And guess why they had credibility? Is because when the apartheid police were shooting bullets and rubber bullets and throwing tear gas, those purple robes of the priests, they were in the streets with the people. They also got the tear gas. They also, they also got stoned. And there's one famous picture of Desmond Tutu where somebody was trying to set someone else on fire, because he was seen as a traitor. And so there's this photo where Desmond Tutu jumps into the middle of the group, literally throwing his body on top of this guy to try and prevent him from being set alight. So, and when then people did die of whatever action, the people at the funerals were the political rallies. The funerals were, I mean, that's true many parts of the Middle East too, isn't it? I mean, that your funerals become your political rallies because you're not allowed to meet anywhere else. So at the funeral, you come together and there's speeches made. And often then over these funerals were the priests. The priests were there, they were presiding, they were also giving the talks. They were, they were saying when people should be calm and go home and when they should go to the streets and so on. So when it came to peace building, they were natural leaders. We looked up to them. They were there because they had the ear and the voice of the people. And so when we had our Truth Commission process, it was natural for Desmond Tutu to be the chairperson of that commission because he had been along with the poor in the streets all along. So it was just natural for him to be there. So it didn't feel strange. It didn't feel out of turn. And when he would use Christian language, and liberals heard this, of course, as being exclusionary. But actually, South Africans didn't experience it as exclusionary, that it was sometimes Desmond Tutu said some things that were kind of Christian from that platform, because Desmond said, President Mandela knew I was an archbishop when he appointed me. So I'm not gonna change not being a archbishop. I am an archbishop. So what the hell do you want me to do? I'm an archbishop. I'm gonna be an archbishop, and that's what I am. So he just was himself, and he had the credibility because he'd been in the streets with the people on the ground. So I would say religious leaders earn the right to be taken seriously in peace processes by being with the victims in the streets, being close to them, and in that way people begin to have credibility. And I could clearly see also in Iraq there were two kinds. There were the religious, there were the imams and who were respected because they were always there and they were always, and then there were the people that were not respected because they just talk whatever the new political wind is. They take on that political wind. So I think it's finding the religious leaders with credibility and respect and working with them so that they can be authentically themselves, not in some sort of religious agenda that's not their own, their own agenda, which is their faith. And then I think that's the contribution that they can make.
That's why thank you so much for the answer. But another point quickly, that's why the other point of my question is if we need to use some religious texts, for example, to try them, we need only clergymen, or we can the practitioners can be, for example, researchers, scientists, or any other men rather than clergymen. but
No,
who understand well the texts, who can interpret
yes.
the texts very well.
I'm sure in principle, Abdelghani, that's possible. I'm sure that's possible. You know, now that you put it that way, yes, I've seen people do that as well. One must just always be very careful that you don't come across as being, what is the word, opportunistic, that you are using certain texts in religion because you have a specific agenda and you're trying to. That is the important thing. But at the same time, of course, yes, religious texts belong to all of us. They don't just belong to clergy. But I think I'm now on theological terrain here, so I'll stop there. But thank you for that question.
Thank you so much.
Now we have Marcus.
Thanks very much for your presentation. Your thoughts around reconciliation as interdependence provides a lot of food for thought for my own context. I'd like to ask around the challenge of interdependence between people of very different cultural orientations as we find it in South Africa. In your book, you mentioned the concept of Ubuntu, which is inherently about interdependence and about communal culture, and which is rooted, as you said, in the southern parts of Africa. Whereas I think many white people in South Africa come from a background that is much more individualistic orientated, secular, and have a Eurocentric mindset. And I'd like to ask, besides the obvious oppression of people of color in the past, isn't another reason for social divides in South Africa that a Western individualistic orientation is also contributing to white people flourishing economically? And if this is the case, this is my assumption, if this is the case, how then can communal and individualistic cultures exist alongside each other, even depend on each other without further entrenchment of social divides? And even if white privileged people realize that their well-being depends on the well-being of people of color as well, would they not remain within their Western secular individualistically orientated mindset, which is often at odds with interdependence in the sense of Ubuntu?
Thank you, Marcus. It's a difficult question. Look, I would be hesitant to ascribe a single culture to white people in South Africa and a single culture to black people in South Africa. I think South Africa is a hybrid country with infinite varieties of different cultures. You get very individualistic black folk, and you get very collective white folk who, you know, if you think about it, apartheid was actually quite a collective approach. It was quite different to liberal model of Western democracies. It was based quite socialist, actually, in many ways, and communitarian as well. And in the Afrikaner history, there's a lot of community upliftment and things like that, which plays to this community. I think Africa has shaped us more than we would like to admit as white people. But yes, at the same time, I think there is something like cultural interdependence, which means South Africa is precisely this country where these two cultures come together in a very big way. And it is precisely the place where the best of both worlds need to demonstrate how they can merge into something new. I mean, and that's why it's cutting edge. I often say to people, yes, we have unbelievable inequality in South Africa, but we're sitting on a global fault line. It's a fault line that runs through the globe. And in some parts of Europe, it's just easy not to see that fault line because it's further away. But in South Africa, we sit right on top of it. And therefore, it is a place of creativity and productivity, also of total fear at times, and feeling like you're in free fall, as you well know. But no, I would not say that white people are, I mean, yes. Did you say that you think that's why they were successful economically? It's because of the individualistic culture?
Yes, that was my assumption, that that a secular individualistic orientation contributed to economic progress.
Yeah, I think that's an assumption you would have to interrogate a bit more. I'm not sure that's self-evident from where I'm sitting. You know, it's probably not. There's a very good book to this effect from Peter Blanche. I don't know if you've read it, The History of Inequality. It's a really good book, and I think it will help you quite a bit in that regard to see how this was. I think inequality in South Africa was manufactured. It's a product of politics, and so you might have seen a very affluent communitarianism in Black communities if it hadn't been for the political machinations of apartheid and colonialism before it. So, yeah, it's not easy to say that it's inherently cultural like that. I feel uncomfortable with that analysis. I think one should look a bit further into that. But that it's a place where we will demonstrate the interdependence between different cultural mindsets. I think it's absolutely true, and I think we're the richer for it, we're the better for it. You know, we should embrace that. And in our better moments, we do that. In our worst moments, we're terrible.
Okay, thank you.
So now Pedro.
Hello. My question has a lot to do with inequality that Marcus just brought up here. And I recently watched a series produced by HBO. It's called Watchmen. And it's set in an alternate reality in the United States of America, where Black people, where a liberal government has instated that Black people should be financially compensated for discriminatory policies and slavery and so on. And in the plot of the series, this compensation makes for a thriving Black middle class, and it ends up impacting a lot of issues that deal with reconciliation. And I couldn't help think about that because I think, as well as in South Africa, in Brazil, we have a very, very serious issue with inequality and poverty. Not just inequality, but outright poverty. And in the state that we're in the pandemic, it's just, you can, if you go out in the streets, you can notice very easily that the number of homeless people has really increased. So what clicked me was that some kind of financial compensation for discriminatory policies, that even though Brazil didn't have any legal form of discrimination after slavery, of course. And how would that play in let's say, bringing more people to have a seat at the table, and how would that foster reconciliation from a financial and social standpoint, those measures?
I don't know Brazil well enough, except to say that Brazil was for a long time held as a example to us in South Africa, with your lunar moment that you had, and then we thought we should have our own lunar moment as well. And now we're not so keen anymore to make that comparison right now. We don't want the Bolsonaro moment, I don't think, in South Africa. But I think, I mean, and this goes back to Ajat's question as well. How do we make this thing of interdependence practical? You know, one of the things that we get, I think we get wrong, is that once we've completed the political arrangements of this process and the institutional reforms, we then want to normalize as quickly as possible the society, and we open for business as usual. But business as usual is inequality producing. And what it does is we don't extend the principle of interdependence to poor people. we extend it to our enemies, but we still regard poor people as dispensable. And we don't see the link between our own, especially in a country like Brazil and South Africa, because you're also sitting on a global fault line. I think you sit on the same fault line that we are sitting on. So here the poor have more power of destabilizing the rich and their lives, and quite frankly can make it quite miserable, even if you have money. So there is a sense of interdependence as well, that if these people were taken seriously as human beings, and given a symbolic yet efficacious reparations package, which means symbolic, it means it restores their own personal dignity, but efficacious, it means it's enough to give them physically a step forward in life. You know, like your fictitious program suggests in the United States, if that were to happen, then presumably the lives of everybody would improve in Brazil, not just the poor. If you would then be able to go and walk in the streets without being shot at, you know, organized crime would diminish. The state would become so it's that sort of, you know, so what we're seeing, in fact, in countries like South Africa and Brazil with extreme inequality is that just draw back into higher castles with higher walls and kind of write off their interdependence with their society at large, and especially the poor become dispensable. And I think we need to turn that logic on its head. But that would require political leadership that would say that the poor's welfare is our priority. And that's often just not present. And so even in South Africa, where I think we've got a good faith president at the moment, somebody who's there for good faith and is doing good work, you know, even in his administration, to really send the message that the poor in South Africa matter, that their lives really, really matter. That message is not coming through sufficiently. So that's something we need to think about, the humanity of the poor, the real human dignity and value of poor people's lives, and how that's just lost in everything. So the reparations need to be both in terms of symbolic reparation of human dignity and material reparation. But then they would have, somebody has to budget for it, and that would mean that it must become a political priority for somebody. And that is often absent, that leadership.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Now we have Benjamin on the list.
Yeah, thank you very much. The last one. And dear Professor Toit, thank you for your lecture, wonderful lecture. I felt very connected to the points and probably to the realistic way of your thinking and showing things, because it's most of the places of people who make research on reconciliation, they a little bit, sometimes I feel they are disconnected. But I feel that you are connected. You are talked about realistic things that are coming from the ground, and I think it's very important to be connected to the ground, and it's wonderful. And what is interesting to me, it's probably related a little bit to my research. It's about the three things I put my attention. It's about the corruption. Social structure we have talked already, so the corruption and the solidarity. So what I have discovered, so till you have this struggle in your place, struggle for peace, struggle for reconciliation, it's great, because some countries that goes a little bit deeper economically, they're losing everything. They just don't have such discussion about struggle. They have a discussion about to survive. So my question is, what is about the economical and reforms that you think would would be better for maybe for your society, or as a maybe at the goal for reconciliation, if it's more a socialistic approach or more capitalism? So it's kind of agenda that I understand that if country economically will not succeed, we'll lose all those processes, because we have such things that happens in a lot of parts of the world when people don't discuss about reconciliation, about surviving. So the question about corruption, how do you deal with it, and the solidarity, I think this connection between them, they link it. So if it's too long, you can just, yes, it's.
Right, now for the next 3 hours to answer that question.
I'm okay, but about you, because it's hard. Thank you.
I can only say, Benjamin, thank you. First of all, if we go back to the issue of trust and reconciliation, that reconciliation and trust are very closely entwined. So as reconciliation increases in society, so does trust also go bigger, because there's more inclusivity of people, more people are involved, and also the processes that happen are more fairer. That means trust is built between people. But corruption is a fundamental breach of trust in the first place. It's not just a stealing of money, it's a breach of trust. And it's a breach of trust from those people that we entrust our public life with. And because it is a breach of trust, it does as much harm as violent crackdowns do, as much harm. So if you have a government coming to kill their own people, bombing from the sky, dropping bombs on their own people, or stealing money from their own people, it has the same devastating impact. So corruption is about, and that is a point I'm also making in this book, is that corruption in modern day South Africa became a fundamental breach of trust, which undermined reconciliation from that level, because we didn't trust the process anymore. And that happened because we got a principle in a president that was out of his depth. And then, I mean, think a little bit about other examples right now. I won't give you any more clues, but you know, a president that's out of his depth, and then realizes that he's going to have to make as much money. He's going to reap the benefits for himself personally. It's not about public benefit, and so it becomes entirely a game within a game that is being played, and then you know, the public becomes very quickly aware of that, and they lose complete faith in public processes, and with that, the faith in reconciliation goes. And so South Africa's faith in reconciliation went, not in the first place because white and black people couldn't get along the last 10 years, it's because we had a corrupt government. And then white and black people started playing up to their worst selves. And so corruption is absolutely fine. And we realize, to our government's credit now, we've realized that. And but I don't know if you've seen in the news that this week was a huge week for South Africa, because the ANC is the governing party. It's the party that has been leading the struggle against apartheid. It is almost untouchable in its power. It's one of the world's grand old liberation movements, and really the only party that can unify South Africa. And it's the party of Nelson Mandela. But it's become corrupt, and so its previous president Zuma was a very corrupt man, and one of his cronies became the Secretary General of the party, who is the head of the party while he's not in government. The party is in government, but they run government, and there's a separation, and the Secretary General runs the party. He has been arrested this week. The top official in the ANC has been arrested this week. This is a massive breakthrough for South Africa. And it comes on the back of basically a truth commission for corruption. We've had a truth and, well, I couldn't say reconciliation, but a truth commission, it's called the Zondo Commission. So after we've, so it's been sitting in public hearings, and people from the previous regime can come and whistleblow there and talk about corruptions. And then that's a group of lawyers and judges, and that's referred to our National Prosecuting Authority. That is vastly understaffed, but they are beginning to arrest politicians. So that is actually, although in other ways it may sound like very unreconciling, that's a very good sign for reconciliation in South Africa. People will regain a sense of trust in the public process because public officials are being held accountable. And it's a funny thing, Abdul Ghani, you will also know out of the Egyptian context that, people are not stupid, people know. They know who the corrupt guys are. It's public. People in the streets talk all the time. They know. And so, who's fooling who, right? But then nobody ever gets to hear again. I'll never forget in Iraq, and with that, I think I'm going to close. But in Iraq, I think at one point their revenue out of oil was $50 billion a year, and their wage bill was $48 billion. It means their salary bill, and what that means is anybody who could cause trouble just got the salary. They just said, whoever has got a gun, we're just going to pay your salary and be quiet, please. And we'll talk about titles later, but just here's a salary, and they kind of bought their stability that way for a bit, and it's devastating. It's made the country as cynical as any place on earth right now because people have seen through it. So corruption is fundamental to reconciliation because of trust, the trust issue.
Thank you very much, Professor. It was very, very good and clear, and trust and corruption, I made those connections, and I will use it in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Fanie, we have now still 3 persons who want to ask questions, and I have also about 8 questions to you, but I would not dare to ask them now. I hope to have more time in other setting with you to discuss them. But how shall we proceed? What would you prefer?
I need to leave in about 10 minutes, Martin. So maybe I will try and answer quickly something of each of the questions. But then if you really have 8 questions, then
I ask one question only, but the others may ask other ones. So,
okay.
So one of my questions was, you were saying, and I agree completely with you, that this agonistic approach has a problem with deeply traumatized people. And you have them directly after every war and civil war. And my question would be how to deal with deeply traumatized people from the interdependence approach, because they often also want to be protected and are not open to talk with the others and want to be alone. And do you think about another first step or whatever? So this was my question. Maybe we take the others all together so that
can collect them.
Attila?
I would like to go from another dimension about politicians and their engagement in the conflict. Like they become military personnel from one day to another during the night. So we have in the case of Kosovo, we have a new tribunal, which is called the Special Chambers for Kosovo, which is going to be a local court, treated as a local court, although it's going to be based in The Hague, and it's going to have international judges. So we are having these different levels of justice. So they are going to treat them as in the local court, and they are, for example, right now they have called in the president of the country as a war criminal. So I would like to have a parallel with Africa. If they sentence him, he has been. Do you hear me? Well.
Yes, yes.
If they sentence him, he has been like 20 years ago in a direct contact with the NATO, with all the Westerners. Or if they don't sentence him, then it's gonna be a revenge to the other party. In this case, the Serbians, and they will say, you see all the fake courts from the 90s, the International Tribunal. So how it's gonna reflect for the Africa? I know that you don't have maybe so much knowledge about Kosovo to answer this, but it's gonna reflect to Africa because, right, you are doing research on South Africa and all the conflicts in Sudan, and they're going to be reflected by this. Thank you.
Then we had two further questions. One is from El Mehdi.
Yes, Dr. Francisco, you can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Go ahead.
But I ended up in my car, like following this very useful and very fruitful presentation, actually. It was very informative for me to listen to you, Dr. Fanie. Fanie de Toit, I feel like it's a French name, I guess, no? So I was like, you know, it was very informative for me, especially for someone like me who is like involved in developing a PhD proposal. You touch on some very important theoretical framework related to the reconciliation, and I think it will serve a lot in making sense of some cases that I'm working on right now. And as you know, I'm originally from Morocco, based currently in Qatar, and I'm supposing that I have a good idea about what's happening here in terms of especially the relationship between the regime that we have in this part of the world and the issue with reconciliation. Those are like it's a kind of structured relation, I guess. I'm gonna go like straight to the case of Morocco that I'm supposing I'm very aware of. Morocco, in the beginning, the very beginning of the new regime of Mohammed VI, after Hassan II, he established, he created what they calls at that time the Equity and Reconciliation Commission. It was like an instanced equity reconciliation, and it was promoted, by the way, as a kind of Middle Eastern and not North African, North African unprecedented, if you want, institute or commission to establish the reconciliation for the new regime at that time. And it was inspired by the experience of South Africa, by the way. I don't know if you are aware of this. And as I said, it was promoted in this concept. And the king at that time make it very clear that he considered this body as a kind of a truth commission, and it was commissioned and mandated to investigate the forced disappearance and arbitrary detention of
So El Mehdi connection got frozen. Then we can go maybe to the next question to Tanya.
Okay, let me just, hello, am I on unmute now? I'm just trying to put my video on, start video. Okay, thank you very much, Professor Fanie de Toit. It was very fascinating, and everybody's questions. I hope I'm not going to be repetitive. Some of it came up, what my question is. On the issue of
carried out under the president.
Hello, should I keep talking? Okay, I'm going to keep talking. On the issue basically of the disappearance of the middle class, it has been proven that South Africans are becoming poorer. So all over the board, previously advantaged, previously disadvantaged, everybody is getting poorer. And with the problems of kleptocracy, and how the state voices the redistribution of money, so to say, then with BEE, which is in practice not Black economic empowerment, but what I like to argue BEEE, which is Black economic elite empowerment, which is still an ongoing problem. And considering in the light of the state capture, the law and order which is denied by the powerful, and crime levels absolutely rising, I found your book extremely positive because it never took these issues as something that is put into the mix. So I really found your book positive for the fact that now my question might give a negative turn to it, and I feel a bit shy to ask it, but in the sense of a hypothesis saying that there's a downward spiraling of society, how would you summarize then interdependencies pitfalls on such a question?
But I think questions are collected, and our guest has to leave us in a few minutes, so we can start.
May I, Francesco, may I request just a summary of the second question on Kosovo? I'm not sure I got the heart of that question. Just a short summary of what is the question exactly?
The heart of the question is that justice is being leveraged. So there is the prime justice, which is being not served among the political elite of the Westerns. And the secondary justice, which is being served, as you quote in your book, by ICC, which is being served by mainly Africans, right? And now we are having a specialist chambers, which is local court after 20 years after the conflict, which is going to be a local court and completely isolated by the ICC. Or it's going to be a building just in the next street.
Okay, and the question is?
Okay, I see. Maybe I'm the wrong person. So the question is that there are two justices right now in the world.
Two kinds of justice.
Two layers of justice. One which is being never served upon the elites, which might be elites in different countries, even in the Western hemisphere, or the second grade of justice, which is being served on certain individuals. I'm not going to repeat now where they are coming from like lower income countries. So do you see this as a threat to reconciliation and justice in the future? I see.
Thank you. All right, Francesco, maybe Almadi, I'm familiar with the Truth Commission in Morocco, so maybe if you could just articulate the question specifically, then I can try and respond to that.
Okay, sure. I'm so sorry. There was something wrong with my connection. I mean, I want just to go straight to the question, even though there are some stuff that I would like to articulate on before. I mean, in the absence of like a solid and lasting and effective institution, I mean, in the context of the non-democratic regimes, how can we like to assure or to ensure in the process of an enduring and continuous like transition, like reconciliation transition? How can you assure that? Even though, I mean, the new regime, the regime that we have in this part of the world, as I told you, they are, as Dr. Ayed said, they are the concealer, and at the same time they are the dictators. They are playing the same role. And this imposes itself, especially in the countries with a kind of rentier pattern. And I'm talking specifically here in the Gulf states, the rich oil states. Those states they can create, the institution for reconciliation as easy as the way that they can like abolish or terminate those kind of institutions. It's just a kind of, I mean, sometimes the whole idea about reconciliation is just an excuse for enduring their regime. I mean, that's my question. If you can just refer to some theoretical framework, perhaps some concepts, maybe some cases where we can like see this like the way in which we can ensure the continuity of democratic transition in non-democratic context.
Okay, I will maybe then try very quickly to respond first to Martin's question about traumatization and interdependence. part of, Martin, what I'm trying to communicate, there's several things in this word. The first is that it's de facto, that it's not something we have to work for. It is already a given. And if we ignore it, it's at our own peril. And so interdependence takes this burden off the peace builder's shoulder that you have to create something de novo. We don't have to create something de novo. We have to transform the existing relationships that there are. And in war zones and heavily traumatized communities, it's almost as if they are erased by the violence. Their identity, their humanity is erased. And so what we should be doing is bring that humanity back to life, make it obvious that interdependence that exists. And so part of what we should not be doing is bringing in agendas that we force on them, whether that is in the name of transitional justice, whether that's in the name of development, whether that's in the name of humanitarian aid, whether that's in the name of anything, and then run roughshod over the people in front of us in pursuit of those larger international agendas. And so traumatization demands really that one starts and seeing the person in front of you in 3 dimensions and fully attentive dialogical engagement of the whole person, and let that person guide you on what they need rather than the other way around. And I think that, you know, for example, just one example is, you know, truth fact-finding in post-war situations. Often fact-finding that's been proven now that in some cases forensic testimonies re-traumatize the victims because they are forced to tell their story in a specific legal way that doesn't help them to work through it. Because if a victim needs to work through it in a narrative way, then you must tell the story like this today, maybe tomorrow you tell it like that, maybe the next day you tell it like that, and the story evolves, and so do the characters in the story, and eventually, you know, it's redeeming. That is the way that memory heals itself. But in a forensic investigation, there's only one version, and it's frozen. So you get frozen in your role as victim there in that moment. And so there's definitely something that we are missing in terms of engaging these traumatized communities in their fullness as human beings, not just the object of our benevolence and so on. Now, it's easily said. It's very easily said, but I think that's along that way that the solution is in terms of that. In terms of Kosovo, because I know very little about that, my brother, and also because I know equally little about Morocco, I will answer them together in this sense, that mechanisms of transitional justice, whether they are truth commissions installed by a king that questions his father's regime, or whether they are competing courts in a country that are trying to compete for legitimacy with each other, and working past each other, and sometimes even competing for the same cases and so on. If these mechanisms are not embedded in a political process, they are not working. There cannot be free-floating mechanisms. None of these mechanisms are silver bullets that can simply add good to the society and take them to a peace process. A peace process is something that is a political process within which we have certain mechanisms built in that help us on certain hurdles. Accountability is only one small part. You know, there is many other aspects of the political process that needs to happen, and then to build these mechanisms in on that. Now, I have problems with Rwanda's lack of political freedom. I have problems with the way that they did some of their things around reconciliation. One thing they did very, very well, though, is they have had a process where they put different levels of justice into a single law or series of laws called the organic laws, which made clear the distinction between them and also the cooperation between them and how they were all contributing towards one political process. And that included the International Criminal Tribunal in Rwanda that sat in Arusha. That included the jurisdictions, national jurisdictions. It also included the Gacaca community courts, all in one system. So I think Kosovo would need political leadership to show what is the process here. Where are we working towards? How are these mechanisms going to help us get there? And don't think these mechanisms are free floating and they're just there for abstract justice, you know, and somehow that'll be a good thing. And the same is true of the Moroccan Truth Commission. I mean, the Moroccan Truth Commission had a great strength, which was its reparations program. And the reparations program is still quoted today as one of the best the world ever saw, along with Chile and others. So Morocco did something really good in terms of its that initial reparations program. But it's, as you say, if there isn't a political transition, so how does one strive for democracy in the absence of democracy? Well, I think you strive for two values, which is the two markers I've set out. The one is inclusivity, and the other is fairness. And you have to agitate for inclusivity and fairness, not expecting these things to happen overnight, but to have a process where you can incrementally see these things gaining traction over time, because then you're moving towards a more interdependent society. On the South African question, look, I vacillate between being a fundamental pessimist one day and a fundamental optimist the other. South Africa can do your head in like that. And one has to be careful not to become permanently pessimistic or permanently optimistic. I think South Africa the question is still out there. However, remember, we're nearly 30 years into democracy, nearly 30 years, and we haven't imploded. And we have given millions and millions more people education. We have created a black middle class that is double the middle class that we had before. Our crime figures have actually come down. They haven't gone up. They have come down. Of late, under Zuma, they did come up a bit again, but they're beginning to go down again. And the reason is public trust. There's a very good, there's a direct analogy between public trust and crime. In communities that trust the police, crime is low. Communities where there's no trust in public policing, the crime is high. And that is actually verified. So South Africa, for me, remains a very, very fascinating place to be, an exciting place to be. And right now, I think we have a new chance to do something. But it's going to be very, very difficult. And that is because we have a moribund economy, most importantly, and we have not sent the right signals to our poor communities and our rural communities, including white rural farmers, that their lives matter as much as those of us in the city centers. And we need to, but we've been at our own throats under Zuma. We've been involved with ourselves, a little bit like America has been under Trump, really. I mean, and America has not been able to tackle anything because they are preoccupied with fighting themselves right now. And it's a sad, sad thing. South Africa was like that under Zuma, but we got rid of him. Our institutions stood up to him. We got rid of him. He is now fighting for his freedom, you know, and his main ally in the ANC has just been arrested this week, Ace Magashule. So there are some signals of hope, and I still think we are infinitely better off than we've ever been in our history as a country. And now I'm saying us as a whole population, not just us as white people. So in that sense, we are a country moving further towards interdependence. I'll stop there. I think now we really are running the risk of having breakfast together.
Maybe it wasn't ironical when you said 4 hours together. We had more than 3. And we have been very pleased and honored to have that you have been with us all this time. It was so precious. such a great opportunity also for our doctoral students to have a direct dialogue with you. So all of you know you already as a book author, and now to have a possibility to have a conversation, you know, it's for me like, I wish I could have a phone call with Martin Buber and say, hey, Buber, what do you mean there? So now we could have this opportunity with you. So it's a privilege. We are very happy that you have been with us.
I believe I've got a new background.
Yeah. We will share it on the Facebook of Vienna Center.
Hello, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes.
Thank you.
I think that is the surest signal that this session is over, actually.
All the best. And we talk on Monday. We talk on Monday.
100%, Martin.
Yeah. So
thank you, everyone. It's been